Hey everyone. So, there are a lot of people who are in spiritual timeout right now. And there are a good handful who are going to be getting off of spiritual timeout just about now. And on your way out, there are a couple of things that you need to be reminded of so that you don't wind up back in the corner again. Alright? Here we go. There are no others here. Part of an incomplete activation or an incomplete awakening is thinking that you, as opposed to others, are something special, something big, something mighty, and everybody else is just an NPC or a peon or. That's you. Everyone is you. There are no others. So, if you go flinging curses or hexes, you have no way of taking cover from that. You're hurting yourself physically, mentally, emotionally, and energetically. You're hurting everybody around you. And you're hurting a bunch of innocent people in the world. You're causing damage to all the living systems, all the biological systems in the earth plane. You're causing a lot of hell. So, there was, and there has been, to different degrees or another, some allowance made for people to get a feeling for how certain things operate when applied practically to the manifest world. And going forth, there will be no more allowance for that kind of fuckery. Which means, quite frankly, that if you're not on the up and up, if you're not acting in a completely knowledgeable way, that is, if you're acting in spiritual ignorance, everything you do will be rendered impotent. This is for the sake of the integrity of the animistic field. This is for the sake of the integrity of the world that we're building and moving into. So there's no more time for any kind of bullshit. There's no more time for anybody being in their egos and acting out of their egos. The personality is a tool, it's an interface in order to work with society, which is obviously a projection of the personality itself. So, personality is an absolutely necessary social tool. Existentially, it has no value whatsoever. And using spiritual knowledge to take advantage of people causes incredible amounts of damage. And oftentimes, the people that are using spiritual knowledge to take advantage of people are at the same time condemning people in the world who use their money, power, prestige, and privilege and position to do the same. There's absolutely no need to engage in manifestation arts, arts of power and control and dominance, from the place of the ego, from the place of the personal will. The personal will has no place here. In fact, to step onto the path, to dive into the void, to dive into truth itself, into the source of creation itself, one has to give up one's personal will. And therefore, one is open to perceiving what the will of the soul is. And the soul always gets its way. And the ego, in its own sense, always gets its way too. But what the ego actually is asking for, with what it does, is always different than what it says it's asking for. Because the ego exists in a mode of self-duplicity. It exists in a mode of self-deception. The soul never deceives itself. The soul doesn't deceive, it's beyond deception. So, whatever is being sold as manifestation, most of it doesn't work, does it? Because everyone is trying to manifest from their ego, which would just cause, even if it did work, it would do nothing but cause more suffering, more chaos, more pandemonium, more destruction, and it wouldn't nourish or feed you or anybody. And the ego is always insecure. It's always unsure about what it wants. Does it want this or does it want that? The soul always knows. The soul is always clear. The soul is always clear. The soul is never in confusion. The soul is never broken. The soul is never fragmented. It's never shattered. It's always whole and complete and in harmony with itself. and therefore with the source of everything. So all manifestation comes from the soul. False manifestation is an attempt to impose one's ego on the world, which is no different than if you were trying to do it with money and other kinds of powers, political powers, and so on. So, if you would be released from spiritual timeout, then you've got to understand that the only thing you even really want anyway is what the soul wants. You don't really want what the ego says it wants or what the ego appears to want. That's all programming. That's all social conditioning. The soul is the only thing that's real. The ego is a shadow. It's not real. It's a mirage. So you rest in the soul, and you stop feeding the ego, and stop feeding or buying into what anybody has to say about it from a so-called psychological perspective, trying to justify it, rationalize it. Let it starve. The reality is the reality. The soul is the soul. And the soul really needs what it needs. And what the soul needs is not simply for the sake of taking pleasure. The ego needs so much to take and chase pleasure. Not that pleasure is bad. Pleasure is perfectly fine. And so is pain, by the way. But the ego is on a mechanical track of constantly seeking a repetitive, memory-based type of pleasure in order to avoid having to feel the pain that is constantly humming under the surface that it doesn't know what to do about. But it can't do anything about it because it is that very pain. So for the ego to actually deal with the root of its pain would have to be to dissolve itself. Because as long as that ego is there, there is pain. The ego is pain. It is trauma. It is hurt. It is suffering. And it's always trying to avoid itself, as well as always trying to kill itself, but also always trying to sustain itself, you see? So it's rather what we would actually call literally schizophrenic, which means split-minded, trying to pull itself in a bunch of different directions, while also trying to keep itself together. You see, it is a walking paradox. It's trying to destroy itself and preserve itself at the same time, which is just insane. So as long as that is there, controlling and running the system, then there's no peace, there's just insanity. And anyway, there's no consistency about what one wants. But what you really want is what has been sometimes called the soul desire, or the desire of the soul, or that's fine enough, or the song of one's soul. But the soul desire is one, and it's clear, and it's in harmony with everything else. So if you are trying to manifest from ego, from the so-called lower self, well, one, it's not in harmony with anything, and even if you did get it, it would simply be too heavy for you to bear. It would destroy you. It would simply end up, and many of you know this, because you've been given the capacity to temporarily manifest from a lower place so you can see what happens. And some of you have learned the lessons, a lot of you haven't. And because you haven't learned the lessons, you've gone into delusions of grandeur, thinking that you're a good manifester and you manifest what you want. You've been allowed to engage in that kind of false manifestation in order that you would learn your lesson. Again, some of you have learned the lesson that be careful what you wish for, basically, right? And others haven't. You've just gotten into a very delusional state in which you consider yourself a great manifester and I get what I want. Has that worked out for you? Right? Are you in peace? Are you in joy? Do you have the inner technologies of ecstasy? Do you know how to close your eyes and flip into exalted states of being at will? Do you know how to move your body and work yourself into a total explosion of energy? Or do you not know how to feel good unless you're taking some chemical or trying to extract pleasure from this or that or the other? Again, I'm not putting pleasure down. In fact, if there's any guilt or shame about pleasure, you won't be able to exalt your own energies. That is, you won't be able to allow what has often been called kundalini or chi or prana, life force energy, to rise up through you. So this isn't about guilt or shame, it's about facing the fact that unless you know how to conduct your energies within your very system, the only thing you can do is keep chasing petty pleasures, which will never satisfy anyway. And then even when you do get the opportunity to indulge in something, you're not even really enjoying it. You're worried about 10,000 other things. So before you can responsibly indulge or engage in anything, you must know, especially if you claim to be a witch or a wizard or a tantric or a shaman or a spiritual initiate or a high priest or priestess. There are so many titles being used, it really doesn't matter. You have to know how to conduct your energy. And as long as you're trying to use apparent powers or spellcraft or ritual or techniques or methods or meditations or whatever it might be to get something to happen out here that you think you want to happen because of XYZ and XYZ, that's all ego. And if you're using ego as the driving force in your practice, in your spiritual, so-called spiritual, methodology or walk or whatever, all that can come from that is incredible harm and suffering. And moving forward from here, you won't be allowed to do that anymore. So, if you're not operating from the soul, then, well, I'm afraid you'll find that all of your efforts are going to be frustrated. And anyway, the real you is not upset by that proclamation. Because the real you is the soul itself, is the eternal being. And that, anyway, must be obeyed. So, the ego only gets to pretend that it can move in a different direction. So the experience of one who is living from the soul is the experience of dancing with life. And the experience of one who's living from the ego or the lower self is being dragged by it. Never quite getting what you want, almost getting it, having it taken away, having it for a while, and then having it mess with you or betray you or blah, blah, all of that. The drama. That's all ego. And clearly you have not been intelligent enough to circumvent any of that. Because it can't be circumvented. It can only be dropped and put aside, seen as silly. Really, it's adolescent. Grow up. The soul, the eternal self, is the only truth. And everything that is a manifestation of that. So if you stay true to the soul desire, to what the soul really wants, and you live from that, and you live a life of expressing the truth, the deep truth of the self, the deep truth of the soul, then everything you actually want and need will come to you, willingly. You won't have to cajole, you won't have to coerce, you won't have to spellbind, which if you see anyway is all violence. And so really what this is about is no spiritual violence is going to be allowed heretofore. You were given the opportunity to see how you would handle it, and some of you succeeded, some of you showed that you weren't responsible enough to handle it, and so you were put on timeout. If you're receiving this message, you are being let out of timeout, but on the condition that you step into the unconditioned self. If you stay in the conditioned self, then you have no capacity to really be here as a being which is anchoring in any kind of meaningful awareness, consciousness. If you're going to be here as a conduit for light, a conduit for peace, a conduit for joy, for love and ecstasy, you first have to know it yourself. Which means you stop operating from the lower self and you submit the lower self to the higher self. That is, all the acquired knowledge of mind and memory become the servant of the soul, become the servant of consciousness. And whatever is meant for you, that is, whatever is necessary in consciousness, will come to you. Your only job is to stay true to that. So if that means speaking, then speak. If it means writing, then write. If it means dancing, then dance. If it means acting, then act. If it means singing, then sing. If it means building, then build. Whatever it means, and you know what it means, throw yourself completely into that. You're here to devote yourself totally to the calling of your soul. And everything that you need, physically, if you're meant to be with a partner, if you're meant to be with a certain amount of money, If you're meant to be in a certain place, that will be. You don't have to contrive it. A relationship contrived is not a relationship. A relationship coerced is not a relationship. A situation of job, of employment, of living which is coerced and contrived is not harmonious. So, when everything is allowed to come, when the soul, when the center of the being itself is allowed to be that magnetic force which draws in that which is in alignment with it, which it is always trying to do anyway. The true self is always in the highest vibration. It's the lower self that is always fluctuating. It can never come up to the highest because it would dissolve. But it's always fluctuating. It's always running around, never quite sure. And it only gets into trouble. So, whatever you need will come. And whatever you need you already have right now. And what you need will be there when it's time for it to be there, when you have the capacity to hold it, when you have the capacity to take care of it. This is about responsibility, not about satisfying your little petty wants. You have to be able to take care of what comes to you. And the capacity to take care of what comes to you is directly related to your capacity to be attentive, to your capacity to be conscious, to be aware, actually aware, which means not feeling sorry for yourself. Not having a narrative of self-pity, and not really not holding anything or anyone in pity. Pity is arrogance. Get rid of it. There's no place for pity here.